Today we will be talking about congressional battleground races. It'll be more of a big picture view. We won't get into the details of individual races, just more of a what are the congressional battlegrounds, why are they important, and what to expect on election night. All right, so starting off, what is a battleground race? Put simply, they are the races, the congressional races that we expect to be the closest in the country. For a more quantitative view of that, those races we expect to be decided by under 5% of the vote, which says margin of victory. That just basically is the margin of votes separating the first and second place finisher in the race. We also have a second tier that we just call races to watch, which are those races that don't necessarily look super competitive now. They're somewhat competitive, but they're unlikely to fall within that 5%. Also, in our battleground races, we include a couple races that we don't expect to be quite that close, but they are races in which an incumbent is seeking re-election, but they appear to be a pretty sizable underdog in the race, and we expect the seat to flip in November. Which, even though these races we don't expect to be like the closest in the country, still think it's pretty important to highlight that, that we expect them to flip, because that's a big deal. An example of that is Illinois' U.S. Senate race. Incumbent Mark Kirk is seeking re-election to his second term, and he's facing U.S. Rep. Tammy Duckworth, and she's been a pretty clear favorite through the entire race, and as a result, there hasn't been a lot of spending or anything in there, since it's not expected to be super competitive. Moving on to the criteria we use to determine these races. So first off, we looked at the margin of victory in the past several congressional races for the seats. So as I mentioned earlier, this is just the margin of votes separating the first and second place finisher. It's a pretty good indication, since districts only change every decade, and if a race was close 2 years ago and 2 years before that, it's likely again that it will be close, since the district makeup does not change very much in a year-to-year sort of thing. Also, we looked at the margin of victory in the past two presidential elections, which, since 2016 is a presidential election, it's arguably more important than the margin of victory in the past couple, say, midterms, even though 2014 was just 2 years ago, because presidential elections are quite different than just midterm elections. They tend to bring out a lot more voters, and they just tend to have quite different results. For instance, in the past decade, they have certainly benefited the Democratic Party, while midterms have benefited Republicans. Moving on, open seats. Open seats are much more vulnerable than seats where a Democrat is seeking re-election. Democrats just have huge advantages. They have more money. They have better name recognition. Basically, people know who they are, and so they're much more likely to vote for them. Along the same lines, time spent in office. Incumbents who have only been in for one term, so 2 or 6 years, are generally more vulnerable than their counterparts who have, say, been in office for decades. Again, it's mostly a name recognition sort of thing. Not everyone, after 2 years in Congress, not everyone has necessarily even done anything significant. So it's not unusual that the majority of voters may not be super aware of what they have done in office. So those three were the initial criteria we used when determining these districts. The next three are the things we looked at as the races started taking shape later in this year. The first being outside spending. This is a pretty clear indication of which races the party committees and other outside groups find to be competitive. If a race is receiving millions of outside dollars from both sides, you can probably bet that it's going to be a competitive race, or at least they think it will be. And it also along the opposite lines. If no one is spending in the race, it's either, well, it's just likely to be very one-sided. Moving on, polling is another indicator. While any one poll may not be super accurate for determining whether a race will be competitive or not, aggregate polling over the months heading into the election can be a pretty strong indicator of the general makeup of a race. For instance, we used to have Ohio included in the Senate battlegrounds, but polling has consistently shown the incumbent to just have a very strong lead in Ohio. So it was downgraded from a battleground to just a race to watch. And finally, we looked at other outside race ratings, specifically the Cook Political Report, Sabato's Crystal Ball, and the Rothenberg and Gonzalez Political Report. They have been doing this a lot longer than we have, so it's definitely good to look at what others are doing and take that into consideration when determining our own rating scale. All right, so the Senate. The Senate is the big chamber in 2016. All eyes are on the Senate to see whether the Republican Party maintains control or Democrats manage to take it back. So there's 34 Senate races up for election in 2016. We have 9 of those currently rated as battlegrounds. Of those 9, Democrats, they need to gain 5 seats to win the majority. One of those seats is currently held by Democrats, so they would need to pick up 5 other seats while defending that one, or 6 other seats in order to win the majority, which is a difficult but not impossible task, because there's a lot of factors contributing to increased Republican vulnerability in 2016. The biggest source of this is simply the fact that Republicans did so well in 2010, which was the last Senate election, Class 3 Senate election, which is every 6 years. So as a result of the huge wave of 2010, Republicans hold 24 of the 34 seats going in. So simply by the numbers, they have a lot more to lose than gain in 2016, and they're largely on defense. Also, 6 of the 9 battlegrounds we've identified are held by freshman Republican senators who were first swept into office in 2010, which 2010 was a very, very favorable political climate for Republicans, and they made huge gains in both chambers. And 2016 is much, much less favorable, being that it's a presidential election for one, and that's there's a lot of drama surrounding the presidential election. Additionally, one of the 9 battlegrounds is a Republican open seat, which is more vulnerable than normal since there is no incumbent seeking re-election. Another factor, Democrats only have the 1 seat to defend, which is Nevada, which will be open following Harry Reid's retirement. So what happens in Nevada is it's definitely a pretty big deal. It's a lot easier for Democrats to win if they manage to hold on to Nevada. And as I mentioned before, the coinciding presidential election. Presidential elections have a big impact all down the ballot, especially in Congress. Historically, well, at least in the last decade, presidential elections have favored Democrats. Larger voter turnout has contributed to that, and Republicans have made pretty significant gains in the midterms. So again, this is likely to benefit the Democratic Party. And here's just a map of the races we currently have designated as Senate battlegrounds. The lighter colors represent the more competitive districts. As you can see, there's a pretty big concentration of the Senate battlegrounds in the Midwest and Northeast, the Rust Belt region, which is generally a pretty swingy region, so it's not necessarily a surprise. All right, so moving on to the U.S. House. The U.S. House there's much less for grabs in the House in 2016 than in the Senate. At the beginning of the election cycle, basically nobody thought that the House could be retaken by Democrats. But then when Donald Trump won the Republican nomination earlier in the year and made some offensive comments, people began asking, well, is it possible if there's a big enough disaster at the top of the ticket for Democrats to win? Which largely the answer was no. Then again, people started asking a couple weeks ago in light of the infamous video from 2005 of Donald Trump's comments. And after that, people started thinking, maybe it's possible. Again, though, it's not a likely scenario. There would have to be a very large Democratic wave for that to happen. So the current Republican majority in the House is 247 to 188, which means that the Democratic Party will need to pick up 30 seats in order to retake the majority. We currently have only 23 races designated as battlegrounds, and then another 14 as less competitive races to watch. And if the Democratic Party managed to win all 37 of those races and not lose any other random race in the country, they would just hit those 30 required and would have a 218-217 majority, which, as you might imagine, is not a very likely scenario. A lot of these races are, well, at least the races to watch are expected to stay in Republican hands or not necessarily be that competitive. So it would take a pretty big wave for this to happen. However, we do expect some amount of Democratic gains, maybe even in the double digits, 10 to 20, but probably not enough to retake the chamber. The odds are certainly against it. And here is the map that shows the districts we currently have highlighted in the House. These are much more scattered than, say, the Senate, which were pretty well clumped up. Also, you can see that there's a lot of the map is not shaded, as there's only just over 5% of U.S. House districts we consider to be battlegrounds. So there are a lot of non-competitive races in the House. And here's just a table showing those races in text form alongside some of the criteria we used when initially determining our battleground races. All right, so wrapping up, what is at stake in this election? Basically, the entire federal government is up for grabs in 2016. There's, of course, the presidency. It's a presidential election, so the presidency is up for grabs. We've all heard a lot about the presidential election, so I'm not going to dwell on that. The Senate, I already explained, there's a good chance of it going either way. Both parties, depending on turnout and how the presidential election goes, both parties could easily end up in control of the Senate after the election. Additionally, the majority on the Supreme Court is up for grabs after Justice Antonin Scalia's death earlier in the year. This created a vacancy in the Supreme Court, which puts increased pressure on both the presidential and Senate elections, since the president is responsible for appointing the Supreme Court justice who will replace him, and the Senate has the responsibility to confirm that appointment. So if the party of the president happens to align with the party of the Senate, it will be a lot easier to get that appointment confirmed, and as a result, we would likely see a more liberal or conservative justice than we would if they were divided, since it will be harder for, say, a Democratic president to get a very liberal justice through a Republican Senate. And as a result, they would just very likely have to appoint a more moderate justice if the two parties do not align. Finally, the House, which I just talked about, it's technically up for grabs. It could flip. I would not bet on it, but it's included here for completeness' sake. And that wraps up my presentation. We'll now pass it back to Kayla for any questions.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. So there's both a chat that people can use and a Q&A tool if you have any questions, but I'm going to start us off. I'm curious what race or races are most interesting to you, or what you've been like watching most closely.
So there's a couple really close Senate races. As I mentioned before, Nevada's a really big race because if Democrats can hold on to it, it's the only seat they're defending, and if they manage to hold it, it will make taking the Senate much easier. Also, New Hampshire Senate is another really swingy seat. New Hampshire's a notorious swing state, and the results of that will play a big role in the Senate as well. In the House, I would say New Hampshire's first district. This is a district which has swapped hands between the current incumbent Frank Winter and the former incumbent Carol Shea Porter. In the past four election cycles, the two have just traded the seats since 2010, and they're both running again in 2016. So it'll be interesting to see if that if that trend continues.
Cool, thank you. Doesn't look like there are other questions, but I want everyone to know that if you have questions later, you can reach out to us in many different ways. There's editor@ballotpedia.org, or on Twitter @ballotpedia, and facebook.com/ballotpedia. And then we have so while this series of webinars is over, we have some other ones coming up. So the day after the election, November 9th, we'll be going over election results. And so at 9 a.m. Central, we'll be talking about congressional results. At 10 a.m. Central, we'll talk about state results. And then the next day, the 10th, we'll be meeting again at 9 a.m. Central and going over local election results. So keep your eyes open for our Twitter, and we'll post those. Oh, we actually have a question. Great. Are there any battleground Senate or House elections in North Carolina?
In North Carolina, yes. In fact, the Senate race in North Carolina is a battleground in 2016. So in that race, Richard Burr is seeking re-election, and he'll face Democrat Deborah Ross. This is not a race we initially had as a battleground, but as the race shaped up, I think we added it in, might have been September. I'm not entirely sure, but as the race shaped up, it appeared to be a lot closer than we initially speculated. So it is now a battleground. It does appear that the incumbent does have a bit of a lead in polling, but the race is close enough that we're definitely watching it.
Cool, great. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, please reach out if you guys have questions later. But with that, I think we'll end today's webinar since we're right at 20 minutes. Cool, thank you all so much for your time. We appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who came to all our webinars. Have a nice day.